When I turned 19, my friends Colin and Nick decided it would be fun to get cigars and go to the Viejas Indian Casino to gamble. None of us knew how to gamble. We barely knew how to smoke cigars. But we thought it was cool. We were 19, and the internet didn't really exist, so the limit of what we thought was cool was based off Scorsese movies and things our older brothers did. We packed into my friend Colin's Saturn, and I headed to an Indian reservation to always bet on black. Not because that was how we thought we would win, just that it would be hilarious for all of us to stand at the roulette table, place every bet we made on black while chanting in unison, "Always bet on black." This was, of course, an homage to the heavily underrated film Passenger 57, starring Wesley Snipes, who would eventually be jailed for tax evasion and obviously someone we shouldn't be taking our gambling cues from. We were pathetically excited about it until we got there and found out that roulette wasn't played at reservation casinos. Instead, we found our way to the blackjack table and quickly lost all the money we brought, which was about $20 each. We then lit our cigars and sat at the slots until a server came by and told us cigars weren't allowed in the casino. The trip was a bust. We wanted to leave, but we couldn't find our friend Colin, who'd driven us. Now, here's a good time to tell you a bit about my friend Colin. He came to America with his family when he was very young. They moved here from Pakistan in the late 1980s and settled to a very large house in La Jolla. This was mainly because Colin's dad was loaded. He did something in the garment industry, but none of us ever knew what. And to be honest, I only spoke to him once during a sleepover at their house when he told me I was too loud and should go to bed. Their family's last name was Hussein, which in the 90s didn't do them any favors. I met Colin doing youth theater. He could almost sing and was a terrible actor, but since his name was Khalid Hussein, he played Aladdin in our production of Aladdin. On more than one account, I remember hearing the girl who played Jasmine, her name was Tiffany Reynolds, tell all the other girls in the harem that Khalid was Saddam Hussein's nephew and was sent here to spy on Americans. Moments later, she would then climb onto a magic carpet with her terrorist love interest and harmonize about whole new worlds. I fucking hated Tiffany. So naturally, I befriended Khalid, and we hung out constantly. He was easily our richest friend, but he was never flashy about it. For example, when the car company Saturn was very popular, his dad bought him a brand new one, and to this day, Khalid still might have that car. The other important thing to know about Khalid is that he was very passionate. He dove headfirst into things and poured his entire soul into them. Regardless of talent level or ability, he would never give up until he found the next thing to pursue at 100 miles an hour. Essentially, the worst person you could bring to a casino. We didn't know this because we didn't know what casinos actually were until now. While we paced the floor of Viejas, holding unlit cigars and repeatedly saying, "Viejas, baby, Viejas." We finally found Khalid holding an ATM receipt and about $500. We told him we were out of money and we wanted to leave, and he told us he was just starting to understand blackjack. Shit. Khalid gave us each another $20 to stay and play alongside him. We did, and within 10 minutes we were wiped out, but he kept playing. 30 minutes later, he was pulling out more money, gave us the keys to his Saturn, and told us to just pick him up later. We drove down to Denny's and talked endlessly about the terrible, life-ruining decisions our friend was making while eating moons over my hammies and Grand Slams. We picked him up about midnight, and he rushed us back to his house without saying much, but driving faster than normal. We asked if he wanted any money while we were at Denny's, but he just kind of made noises and kept looking straight ahead. He was in the zone, the danger zone. When we got to his house, he told us he was tired and going to bed and that we all had to leave. About 5 hours later, I was woken up by the telephone ringing. It was Khalid. He was driving down my street to pick me up and take me to breakfast. I told him no. It was 6:30 in the morning and we were 19. We're not supposed to be up before noon. He said we could go wherever I wanted. He had just left Viejas. Apparently, he immediately went back after kicking us out the night before. He had been playing for almost 5 hours and won $26,000. When he got to my door, he reiterated that breakfast was on him wherever I wanted. Now remember, this was 1999. Instagram didn't exist, and brunch wasn't really a thing. So we went to Coco's. We ordered the most expensive things on the menu. He left a $40 tip, and we were off to pick up our buddies Nick and Richie. Khalid took us golfing to Red Lobster, followed by a trip to Warehouse, which, for those of you who just turned old enough to drink last week, was a store that sold CDs and shit. He told us we could each pick out 5 things and he would buy them. It was insanity. We were like kids in a candy store. For this day only, the world was our oyster, and we filled it with Bad Religion CDs and overcooked seafood. The whole time we knew we should probably have a talk with him about gambling and how this was a really fun and generous day, but that he shouldn't go back to Viejas for a while. We knew that talk should be had, but it was hard to do it over steaks at Ruth's Chris and a night out at the movies. The day came to a close, and we came up with a plan to keep Khalid at home that night. Richie would stay with him, get him drunk, and then steal his keys. This probably wouldn't work every night, but also it might. The next day, Richie and Khalid were at my door again, this time with Nick in Nick's car. They had succeeded in not going to the casino, but had overcompensated too far in the other direction, gotten too drunk, and lost Khalid's keys entirely. Today's plan was to get a few more friends together, and Khalid was buying everyone lobster and margaritas in Mexico. This made me a little nervous. I hadn't been back to Mexico since I was 12, and we visited my uncle who bought a small house in Ensenada. I was nervous because although I took Spanish in high school with the intention of learning the language so someday I could go back and fully partake in the culture, I went to high school next to the border, where everyone in my class already spoke Spanish, and they just let me cheat. To this day, all the Spanish I know is "Donde está el baño" and "Cómo está?" Everyone else in our group seemed so excited to go and I didn't want to ruin the trip. So off we went to get free lobster and whatever else our newly addicted and potentially mentally unstable friend was going to offer. When we finally made it down to Puerto Nuevo, we realized we had no idea where we were going because we also realized nobody in our group spoke Spanish. After walking aimlessly, we finally saw a drawing of a lobster on a menu and knew immediately that this was the place. We ate, we drank, we felt like kings, but also felt like maybe it was time to get back, since again, we didn't know anything about anything, except that we were kind of having a good time. Khalid and I hopped back into Nick's car, and Khalid pulled out about 5 bottles of liquor he had bought while we were in the bathroom. We told him to get rid of it because none of us were legal drinking age in the States, and what if we got stopped at the border? But he laughed it off and said he would put it in the trunk. And that's when Nick snapped, "There's no room in the trunk!" We all just stared at Nick, who quickly apologized and said the trunk was full because he had just packed up for college. Khalid said he would just push the booze under the seats. Push the booze under the what? Listen, I told him, I don't care if you're Mr. Moneyman now. I wasn't great at insults yet. I'm not going to prison because you wanted tequila from Mexico. He assured me that he would take all the blame and to just cool down, man. Fucking Husseins. A couple miles down the road, we were at the checkpoint, and 2 guys with automatic weapons asked Nick to pull the car over, and then demanded that we all get out of the car. I looked at Khalid and with my gaze, seared a hole through his skull, and then turned to the guards and asked, "Donde está el baño? ¿Cómo está?" The guards found Khalid's stash of booze under the seats. Khalid said it was his. They grabbed him and pulled him into the building. I expected to hear the sound of automatic weapons firing into Khalid because I was pretty certain that booze that had been legally purchased was punishable by death. A few minutes later, Khalid walked out of the building laughing with the guards as we were told we could go. We hopped into the car as quickly as possible and took off. Khalid told us he gave each of the guards $50, and then they laughed really hard, so he gave them $50 more. They continued to laugh and then said something in Spanish to an interpreter who told Khalid they are laughing because they were going to let you go anyway. They even gave us the booze back. Mr. Moneyman strikes again. About a mile down the road, we heard a noise. Our tire was flat. We were on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. I had a cell phone, but again, this was 1999, before what we now know as reception was invented. If I was in another country, it was going to cost me $100,000 to make a phone call. We were about a mile from the checkpoint, a mile from the next exit, and had no idea what to do. We asked Nick if he had a spare in his trunk, to which he quickly snapped, "No!" So in our infinite wisdom, we split up. Nick began to walk back to the checkpoint while Khalid and I stayed at the car. After about an hour of playing Would You Rather and Fuck, Marry, Kill using the Spice Girls, which, by the way, is not hard. You fuck Scary Spice, you marry Posh Spice, and you kill Baby Spice. No one wants to put up with that lollipop shit. A couple of guys walking by stopped and asked if we needed help. We showed them the tire, and while I fumbled through words that sounded like Spanish, one of the guys asked in perfect English, "Do you have a spare?" I never felt more white. We told him we didn't, but he asked again, "Well, did you check?" We hadn't, because Nick assured us there wasn't. But Nick was gone. He was at the checkpoint or walking on the freeway or dead. For all we knew, this was our car now. I took the keys, walked over and opened the trunk, which was filled with a little bit of college stuff and a Costco amount of porn. Lots of it. Magazines, DVDs, a few VHSs. Let's just say if the trunk was 7-layer dip, the porn was the beans. Just a lot of porn. Colin and I laughed very hard. The two Mexican guys looked at us and smiled wide because for all they knew, this was my car. And I just like to drive around with a lot of porn and a little bit of bedding in my trunk. Once we rifled through it, sure enough, at the bottom of the porn ocean, there was a spare. The two guys helped us change the tire. Call it offered them some money, and they declined. And then I did what any self-respecting American would do, and I offered them some porn. Donde está el baño? When we drove back to pick up Nick, he saw the spare on the car, and he refused to look any of us in the eye. We didn't say a word because this was before internet porn. And back in those days, if you had porn, you had to own it, literally and figuratively. There was no use in kicking a man when he's down unless that's what you're into, and by the contents of the trunk, so was Nick. When we finally made it back later that night, Khalid offered to open the tequila and turn on the spa. The events of the day had taken it out of us, and a solid night's sleep was in order. Not for Khalid. He seemed anxious, couldn't sit still, and really didn't want anyone to leave. I told him to come to my house and we could watch Conan, and he could explain to me why the hell he would marry Ginger Spice. He said he'd just rather stay at home. All the stress of being stuck in Mexico for most of the day made us completely forget about Khalid's gambling problem. But about 10 minutes after getting to my house, Khalid called me and asked if I wanted to go to Viejas. I said no. Then he offered me $100, and I said yes. It was like he was reborn. I had never really been around someone with a serious addiction before, but the signs were so obvious, and it would have been funny if it weren't so concerning. On the way, he told me he could turn the rest of the money he had, which was around $20,000, into $40,000 overnight. He knew the system now. He knew what he had to do and how to read the other players. He was the master, and he was going to show me how to win big. Within an hour of sitting down at the blackjack table, he was asking me for the $100 back. I refused. I'm not sure if you've ever watched someone lose $20,000 in what seemed like an instant. To watch the color drain from their face, the realization that whatever high they were feeling was now over. The drug had worn off, and nothing but his car keys was in front of him, which I quickly grabbed and told him we were leaving. I don't know why he listened, but he did. On the way home, he asked if we could pull over. It was night, and there wasn't anything around the reservation, so it was pitch black aside from the stars and the occasional car passing by. I honestly didn't feel like being on the side of another freeway that day, but the tires were fine and Colin's trunk was empty, so we hopped out and stared at the sky. Colin just started to cry. He had just lost more money than any of us had ever seen, and there's not really a stock response for that other than, I'm sorry. After a couple of minutes, Colin broke the silence and asked me if I was scared earlier when we got stranded in Mexico. I told him I was, but I was really thankful for those guys who had helped us. He said he was scared and the only thing he could think of was to offer people money. I said same, but with porn. I'm completely broke now, he told me. My dad is going to be pretty pissed, and I don't think he's going to give me any money for a while. I told him saying that kind of stuff out loud makes people think he's a terrorist. We both laughed for a few seconds. I'm serious, Colin said. I don't know what I'm going to do now. I was scared of being lost in Mexico, and Colin was scared of being lost in his own mind. And both had pretty significant language barriers. We got back in the Saturn. I told him he should really stop gambling. He asked if we could get food. We went to Coco's. I paid.
Dallas McLaughlin. Let's hear it for Dallas.